and listen to me carefully. Each and every word I'm explaining to you should be listened to very, very carefully. So yesterday we were discussing about the stoop. We actually discussed about the Sanchi stoop, that how, I mean, it was this stoop was quite lucky, and because of the wise decisions made by few people, this particular stoop survived. The Europeans, especially the English and the Frenchmen, they tried to take away the eastern gateway of this stoop, but they couldn't do so because the then rulers of Bhopal, where this stoop was actually found, they saved it. They did not allow them to take it away. Rather, they were given the what? Tell me, carefully prepared plaster cast copies. So they had to be happy. They had to be satisfied with the same only. Okay, so children, in this part on page number 83, the points that you must take a note of is, I'm just repeating those points, and just make sure that you have underlined those points. Other than the introductory part I'm repeating, I have already covered that yesterday. So what I discussed yesterday in the later part, especially the first paragraph on page number 83, it is about the European interest in the stoop of Sanchi, because these people, they were quite interested in the antiquity, in the ancient things, in the ancient history of India. And I told you, I remember that sorry, in the previous lecture also, that even till date, people from different parts of the world, they come to India to be a part of different excavational projects, because in this regard Indians are very, very lucky. We are very fortunate to have such a rich history, though we do not give much respect to that. Many of us are ignorant. Many of us are we simply take it for granted. But we are actually very, very fortunate to have such a rich heritage and culture. So people all over the world, they come here to pursue their PhD programs also. They pick up particular path, facing it our country, and they come here to simply proceed with their PhD programs, the research work, and all. So this is not the case that is happening nowadays. This has been the scenario from the very early time, when the Europeans, they started with the excavations, and people started taking more interest in archaeology and the findings of the early times. Even then, the Europeans, they wanted to take away the Indian artifacts. So in the this particular Sanchi Stoop, where we find that both Englishmen and French wanted to take away the the original Eastern gateway, but they were not allowed by the then rulers. Anyway, so the points to be taken a note of from this paragraph are: French asked Shah Jahan Begum's permission to take away the Eastern Gateway, but Eastern Gateway this was best preserved. They wanted to display the same in museum in France. Then Englishmen also wanted the same, but both Englishmen and French, they had to be satisfied with carefully prepared plaster cast copies. Take. Then in the second paragraph, now you need to understand that, as I said, that this particular stoop, it was preserved, it was properly conserved, because of which till date it is like it's there. But I would be coming to another stoop that I would be discussing later on, which did not have the same fate, and most part of it got actually destroyed. That is the Amravati stoop. I'm not going to that part, but first you need to understand that why. That was just one reason, that these Englishmen and French, they were not allowed to take away the actual gateway. But other than this stoop had been so lucky to survive because of the decisions made by these two rulers, Shah Jahan Begum and Sultan Jahan Begum. Shah Jahan Begum and her successor, Sultan Jahan Begum. So both of them, they understood the significance of this particular stoop, and not only they provided money for preserving Sanchi, They even funded the museum later on and the guest house where John Marshall lived and wrote the volumes, which later on he dedicated to the Sultan only. Children, I hope yesterday we discussed the name of Alexander Cunningham and you answered it correctly. Today we are referring to the name of John Marshall, and I hope you remember about John Marshall also. So, anybody would like to answer who was John Marshall? What was his contribution? He actually has got a very important place in Indian history, in our country's history. John Marshall. Who would answer? Anyone? Yes, I'm expecting an answer.
He
Anushka,
did
are you there?
excavations in Harappa.
Ma'am, he looked for patterns in everyday life also.
Like Indus Valley
Yeah,
civilization.
correct.
You and
You remember Alexander Cunningham missed the significance of this particular civilization, but due to the contribution made by John Marshall, he was the one who brought into light the existence of this civilization and announced it to the entire world. He was assisted by two Indian archaeologists. Might have forgotten their name. Please revise that chapter. Ramaldas Bhai and Dayaram Sahni. You are not supposed to forget their names ever, being history students. Well, anyway, John Marshall's name is very, very crucial, very important. I hope you all have marked your attendance because today less students are attending the class, so I'm going to post their name. I can see only 39 attendees here. So those who have not marked their attendance, they are going to, I mean, their names are going to be published. So make sure that you mark your attendance. Thank you. Anyway, I'll continue. So as I was telling you that both these rulers, Shah Jahan Begum and Sultan Jahan Begum, they came up with the monetary support also. Like they funded the museum and the guest house where John Marshall lived and he wrote the volumes. And they even funded the publication of those volumes. And that is why the reason was that why John Marshall dedicated his important volumes on Sanchi to Sultan Jahan Begum because he also was feeling so grateful towards them. He had this, it was like a token of gratitude towards these two ladies who understood the significance of this ancient site and not through monetary support. They came up with all sort of support they possibly could have done towards the conservation and protection of this particular stoop because it was due to their wise decisions only that this particular stoop it simply escaped the eyes of railway contractors, builders, and those who were looking for finds to carry away to the museums of Europe. And you know what? Why this stoop is so significant? I mean, if we check this out, you would be simply surprised because this stoop, this entire architecture throws light on early Buddhism, all aspects of it. Entire architecture of this stoop. I would be throwing light on its different parts also later on, and Harmika, Yashti, different parts I would be explaining to you. So this entire architectural building, this entire monument, it has been so helpful to archaeologists and historians to understand the different traditions, the then traditions of early Buddhism. And this today we find that it stands as a testimony to the successful restoration and preservation of a key archaeological site by the Archaeological Survey of India. Key archaeological site by the Archaeological Survey of India. So, in the upcoming part and later on also, we would be discussing about the significance, why this mound was built, who built it, what exactly did it contain, who paid for its, who paid for or who contributed towards its construction, when was it discovered. We are going to find out the answers of all these questions with the help taken from text, culture, architecture, and inscriptions. So from here, I would be taking you to the next part of the chapter, and it talks about the background, the sacrifices and debates. Sacrifices and debates. So, first point that you must take a note of in this part is that mid first millennium BCE, that is 6th century CE, mid first millennium BCE is often regarded as a turning point in world history. And why so? We have already read few points regarding the same. This was the same time when the early kingdoms and empires were coming up in the Ganga Valley. If you remember, in the second chapter, we discussed the same point. Now we are elaborating the same topic of discussion. So it is often regarded as a turning point in world history. Why? So the answer is because this is the same time point when the world basically witnessed, the most famous thinkers, the philosophers like Zarathustra in Iran, Kongzi in China, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in Greece, then Mahavir and Gautam Buddha in India. Zarathustra in Iran, Kongzi in China, Socrates, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. In Greece, I hope you have heard their names before as well. In class 11th, if you remember, I did teach you about little bit about Socrates, Plato, Aflatun. You remember the Arabic names and all? We discussed this part.
Yes,
Then,
Yes, ma'am.
thank you, Beta. Then Mahavir and Gautam Buddha in India emerged. This is the first point why this particular time period is considered to be a turning point in world history. Second point could be the same thing, but before that, you need to understand that why these thinkers, they are given so much of regard. What exactly they try to search for? Something which many a times you might also have thought about, but you think that you are such an ordinary being, so you are simply wasting your time. But that should not be the case, because each one of us, each individual that you find in your home, then in your locality, I mean, as your friend or your relatives, something that is so crucial to us, that as an individual we sometimes feel so lonely, and our mind takes us to almost every corner of the world. There is nothing which we cannot think about, which we cannot think of. We sit and so many thought processes start entering our brain. Sometimes we are able to have control over them, at other times we don't. Sometimes the negativity simply overpowers us. I think you all have experienced this particular phase or this, situation. I used to feel this situation just before my mathematics exam. I remember when I was a kid, especially in class 8th and 9th, I till date remember, just before my maths examination, I would sit down and all of a sudden I would become very philosophical, start thinking about the different aspects of life, that why am I here? What is the purpose of my life? Has this ever happened to you? Do you get this kind of time? Do you think about these philosophical things? What is after
Yes,
death? I
ma'am.
mean, you think, no? See, this happens either when we are very, very like disappointed, our heart is broken, we are sad, we are gloomy, there is no one to talk to, or sometimes we feel like our parents are not they are not understanding our situation. Then our mind tends to think in that direction. So it is the same point of time when you have to have control over your mind. There is a very famous Buddhist saying, master your mind, don't allow your mind master you. But actually statement is somewhat different, but implementing the same, following the same in your practical life is very, very difficult. And if we start following the same very strongly, or giving it all 100%, then we would become saint, and that is not possible. So that is why we are human beings, because still so much part of our brain is not known. We don't comprehend it. And many a times we have very strongly felt that we are unable to control the negative thought processes which are coming and going from our mind. And this is so true. This is not just that you are students, you are children, that is why it is happening to you. This happens to everyone, even the adults, the individual, no matter how much mature they have become, still they go through the same phases. Anyway, so I was discussing about these philosophers, and they exactly, they tried to get the answers of the same questions. They tried to understand the mysteries of existence and the relationship between human beings and the cosmic order. What is the connection? Because there are philosophies, there are religious practices where God is something which cannot be seen. It itself is an abstract idea. And if we take example of Buddhism, there is no such concept of God in Buddhism. I mean, Buddhism again is divided into different schools of thought, but there is this particular school of thought that completely rejects this idea that there is anything called God. It simply believes that there is this power of law of cause and effect. So your karma, your actions would finally decide what kind of life you are going to lead. So obviously, this was the time when people, when scholars, when these philosophers, thinkers from different schools of thought, they were coming up with their own understanding of life, the way they had perceived the life and its different, practices, their understanding, the way they had conceived the idea of life. So they tried to understand the mysteries of existence and relationship between human beings and the cosmic order. And this was the same time, as I said, the new kingdoms and cities, they were also coming up, and they were actually influencing the then social and economic life to a greater extent. And this was specifically happening in the Ganga Valley. So you have to take a note of these 3 points. I hope I have made myself clear. And next subtopic talks about the sacrificial tradition, because something new was coming up, but there was already something that was being practiced. So either that was being accepted the way it was, or people wanted to have some modification. Why these mixed songs, they again and again come up in our society, like the songs which were sung in old ages. I mean, like I have heard many such songs, kya bolte usko, remix, something like that. Fine. So those songs are all good. Then how come people started going for improvisation and experimentation? They are changing the song, they're playing with the lyrics, they're playing with the music. Why they are doing so? As per their convenience, as per their understanding, they are coming up with their kind of their particular image or visualization about that song. So in then Indian society, already there were certain religious practices or beliefs which were quite established. Fine. So what were they? I have already discussed the same with you, but once again, I'm simply explaining those points to you. So these pre-existing traditions of thought, religious beliefs and practices included the early Vedic tradition. Early Vedic tradition that was known from Rig Veda. So once again, to explain the same point, on the basis of composition of the Vedas, there are two different periods, the Rig Vedic period or the early Vedic period and the later Vedic period. In the early Vedic period, that begins from 1500 BCE and goes till the Rig Veda was composed. And in the later Vedic period, that starts from 600 BC, 1000 BC and goes to 600 or 500 BCE, the later Vedic period is considered. And in later Vedic period, the rest of the Vedas were composed. Which all Vedas? The Sam Veda, the Atharva Veda, and the Yajurva Veda. Fine. So that is how this periodization is done. Just excuse for a minute, I'll just say the. Thank you. Okay. So I'll continue. it is early tradition which is known from Rigveda. It was compiled between 1500 to 1000 BC. This time frame, children, it's very important. So take a note of it. And in Rigveda, we find many hymns were written, and they were in praise of varieties of deities. Especially few deities were very much worshipped, like Agni, Indra, and Som. And you know, Agni till date is very important in Vedic traditions. Even in Hindus, you must have observed those सात फेरे, जो सात फेरे लिए जाते हैं, those सात फेरे, they are also taken around the Agni Kund, where Agni is already lit. You know, Agni is very, very important. It is believed that Agni is the messenger of this world, and it takes the messages from this world to the other world, Ihalok and Paralok. I'm continuously telling you the Sanskrit terms also which you need to know. Ihalok and Paralok. Ihalok means this secular world, and Parlok means that supernatural world. So Agni is considered to be the Sandesh Vahak or the messenger. So even now, whenever this any sort of puja happens in any Hindu family, this Havan is a very important part of that. And Agni is lit, and what is done? Several items are put into Agni, and the mantras are again and again continuously they are chanted. So what exactly is the task of this Agni? They are accepting those mantras. It is accepting those ahuti or sacrifices and simply taking it to the other world, to the god, the particular god or deity that particular householder is worshipping. So you need to understand that all began Vedic period, and specifically there were so many hymns which were written or which were composed praising these three particular gods: Agni, Indra, and Som. And what exactly people prayed for? There was a long list of their wishes, but some of them were very important, like cattle, sons, good health, long life. Cattle, so that they remain prosper. Sons, to basically the family should be running, because the society was patrilineal. People believed that the family could only be run in name of a male person. So sons were again and again prayed for, then good health and long life. Well, then in the initial period, means in the Vedic period, Rig Vedic period, the yagya or yajna or sacrifices, they were performed collectively. But from later Vedic period, we find that many of these, they were performed by heads of households. Head means the karta, that mukhiya. So usually this particular position is given to someone who earns for the family. Fine, he becomes the head or the mukhiya or the karta of the family. So these yajnas sometimes would be performed by the heads of households. The purpose was all the same, for the well-being of the domestic unit. Other than these sacrifices which were performed in different families, there were some elaborate sacrifices like Rajasuya and Ashwamedh. And I am quite sure you must have heard about these yajnas or yagya, because their references could be found in Ramayana. You must have heard about it. So Rajasuya yagya or yajna and Ashwamedh yagya, which are performed by chiefs and kings who depended on Brahmin priests to conduct the ritual. So they would definitely be taking help of the Brahmin priests. Their main task was to perform these yagya or yajna or the different rituals. So in both these paragraphs, I hope you have taken a note of the important points. And from here, I am proceeding to the next part of the chapter, that is about the new questions. So as I said, it's not these philosophers or thinkers or scholars who simply think about the life and its mysteries. It's like people like you and me also, who consider life as being so mysterious, and at many points in time in our life also we simply sit and start pondering about these unanswered questions. Actually nobody could answer it, but still it's our mind, and it would take us to different angles. It would make us think about different things. idle. So definitely, sometimes being idle also, and sometimes when we kind of start what to say this Atma Chintan, we start thinking about our own life. We start getting involved into these kind of discussions. So the similar thing was happening in the same period also. Like many people, they were curious about the meaning of life, possibilities of life after death and rebirth. And my dear children, this question is something that has like kind of what to say made people belonging to different ages think, but till date we don't have any answer. Be it Egyptian civilization to certain extent in Indus Valley also, though conclusion of archaeologists is that they did not believe in afterlife. But if we consider the particular Sanatan religion or even Buddhist religion, because Buddhism and Jainism both, they focus a lot on the karma or the action that is done by an individual, because that only would be deciding your life, this life, after life. There's certain questions which are till date unanswered. Well, anyway, these are the questions even asked by the common ordinary people also. Possibilities of life after death and rebirth. These issues were hotly debated. Understanding and expressing the nature of the ultimate reality. So, how is that ultimate reality? Ultimate reality, we are actually pointing to that God Almighty. In some schools of thought, it has got a shape, it has got a particular shape to connect with. There are other schools of thought which believes in the abstract idea of this superpower. Then outside the Vedic tradition also, there were other schools of thought, religious leaders, which kept on asking that whether or not there even was a single ultimate reality. And they kept asking questions on the significance of sacrificial tradition. There were many schools of thought who were not convinced by the sacrificial tradition. On the same page number 85, we find debates and discussions. Obviously, whenever some thought processes would emerge in the minds of the scholars, philosophers, or the ones who were said to be the religious leaders, philosophers, they tend to have live discussions and debates. And if we check out the Buddhist texts, we find that there were as many as 64 sects or schools of thought. So the teachers belonging to these schools, they would be traveling widely from one place to another. They would try to convince one another. Even the lay persons, not only the teachers of a particular religious school, they would also be trying to convince the lay people, the lay persons, about the validity of their philosophy or whatever they had understood so far looking at the world. Now, children, again, I'm trying to tell you one thing: a religion, a philosophy, or a way of life is something, and you would be following that particular, philosophy till the time you have faith in it. So it was continuous, it was an ongoing process. These religious, they would be traveling to convince people, as well as the teachers of other religious school, about the validity of the practice they follow, so that the teachers along with the people, they must come and join their school of thought or belief in.
Ma'am, your voice is breaking a lot. We cannot hear anything.
Who is this?
Ma'am, Kalash.
Okay. Is there anyone else who is facing this problem?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
See, no problem. I'm just changing my question. Don't worry. In lecture is again getting recorded. So I can see my of the network is excellent. I don't know. Then okay, this message come. Whose chat box is this? Your network is causing poor call quality. Give me 1 minute. I'll change my location. Is it better now, children? Is it better now? Is it better now? Alfie?
A little.
A little. Thank you, Abhinav. Anyone else? Neha, am I audible now?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Question, I hope work. Okay. So I'm actually talking about I was coming to Kutagar Shala, and just prior to this, I was talking about that how the different the teachers who belong to different religious schools, they would be traveling from one place to another, trying to convince the ordinary people as well as the religious teachers of other schools, so to get them as their followers. So it was kind of a practice going on. People would be simply interacting with one another, exchanging their ideas. Each would try their level best to convince to the other person about the validity of their faith, so that others could get convinced and start following the faith that particular person was propagating or preaching. Many a times these debates, they used to take place in Kutagar Shala. Kutagar Shala. Its meaning is basically a head which has got a pointed roof. A hut which has got a pointed roof. See, children, I am referring to page number 85. I hope you are taking a note of the page numbers so that you can get connected to that. So this Kutagar Shala was one such place where these kind of debates would take place, or in grooves where usually the traveling mendicants, they used to stay. So whenever they would be staying at any such place, they would be discussing about their philosophies. And this would be observed that if one teacher, he would convince the teacher of the other religious school, he along with all his followers would become disciples of the previous religious school's teacher. This practice would go on. It was all about convincing about your ideology to the other person. Fine. So at the same point of time, we find that many of such teachers, like which included Mahavir and Gautam Buddha, also question the authority of the Vedas. Now, once again, you need to understand here that by 6th century BCE, the society regarding the ritualistic practices started becoming quite kind of strict. They started following the names more strictly, and this is the same time period when even the caste system started being based on birth instead of occupation. Okay, thank you, students. So even Mahavir and Buddha also, Lord Buddha also questioned the authority of the Vedas. And I was telling you, ritualistic practices and I mean, they making the religion quite complicated. Ordinary people, especially, they started finding it to be very difficult to, remain dependent on the Brahmin priests to get any sort of puja or yagnas performed in their houses. So the practices are getting more complicated, and they were actually kind of shaping, the nature of these religious practices. So even Lord Buddha and Mahavira, he questioned the authority of the Vedas, and they started emphasizing on individual agency because they believe that men and women both, they could survive to attain liberation from the trials and tribulations of worldly existence. They simply rejected this idea that people belonging to certain caste group only have this, access, or only they could avail, or they could attain that highest world. But these two religious schools, they believed very much that both men and women belonging, irrespective of belonging to any social strata or any caste group, they can simply attain liberation from the trials and tribulations of worldly existence. We have already seen that, and already observed that Buddhism simply rejected this idea that an individual's social status could be determined by his or her birth in a particular caste or gender. We have already discussed this in the previous chapter, but you must note this down as being important. So this part is explained on page number 85. The points you must understand and take a note of is about the lively discussions, 64 sects or schools of thought, then religious teacher trying to convince one another, even lay persons, to be convinced about the validity of their philosophy, then explanation of Kutara Shala, or the groups where traveling mendicants, they would stay and they would be discussing about their philosophy. Then the last paragraph on the same page about Lord Mahavir and Buddha questioning the authority of the Vedas and emphasizing on individual agency, rejecting the idea that a person's caste or gender by birth would only determine whether that individual could attain salvation or not. So these are the important points to be taken a note of from this particular part of the chapter. From here, I would move to the next part, page number 86. And this particular part talks about the Buddhist texts, how they were prepared and preserved. Children, this part once had been asked in board examination for 4 marks. There was this 8-mark question, and this question had 2 parts. One part was taken from this box, this piece of information. So I would request one of you to read it out loudly. It is basically talking about Lord Buddha's teachings, that how not during his lifetime, but after his death only all his teachings were compiled. And they were like kind of, these compilations, they were put into 3 different baskets. This is called the 3 pitak, or the 3 baskets. And these 3 baskets basically hold different types of texts. Like there is this Vinay Pitak that talks about or discusses the rules and regulations for those people who had joined the Sangha or monastic order. Then Lord Buddha's teachings were included in the Pitak, and Abhidhamma Pitak, it basically deals with philosophical matters. So not only in India, when Buddhism traveled to other parts of the world also, there the philosophers, they also tried to translate and compile the works of Lord Buddha. Like in Sri Lanka, it was compiled under 2 texts, Deepavansh, that is the chronicle of the island, and Mahavansh, the great chronicle. Fine, so I would request anyone whose network is of good quality to read this out loudly. Please, anyone.
Ma'am, that is on the screen.
Pardon? Page number is 86, Kalash. You want to read, Kalash? Anyone quickly? Abhinav, you are quite active. Read.
Okay, ma'am. The Buddha and other teachers taught orally through discussion and debate. Men and women, perhaps children as well, attended these discourses and discussed what they heard. None of the Buddha's speeches were written down during his lifetime. After his death, circa 5th century BCE, his teachings were compiled by his disciples at a council of elders or senior monks of Vesali, Pali for Vaishali, in present-day Bihar. These compilations were known as Tipitaka, literally three baskets to hold different types of texts. They were first transmitted orally and then written and classified according to length as well as subject matter. The Vinaya Pitaka included rules and regulations for those who joined the Sangha or monastic order. The Buddha's teachings were included in the Sutta Pitaka, and the Abhidhamma Pitaka dealt with philosophical matters. Each Pitaka comprised a number of individual texts. Later, commentaries were written on these texts by Buddhist scholars. As Buddhism traveled to new regions such as Sri Lanka, other texts such as the Dipavamsa
See, the
and
pronunciation is Deepavansh, but since it's written in English, the M is used. Basically, pronunciation would be Deepavansh, but when you would write the name of this particular text, you would be writing the same way it is given in NCERT. And if you find it to be difficult, see, you have to learn the name, but still you can write the English translation also. That is the Chronicle of the Island. Continue, Abhinav.
other texts such as Deepvansh and Mahavansh were written, containing regional histories of Buddhism. Many of these works contain biographies of the Buddha. Some of the oldest texts are in Pali, while later compositions are in Sanskrit. When Buddhism spread to East Asia, pilgrims such as Farzin and Xuanzang traveled all the way from China to India in search of texts. These they took back to their own country, where they were translated by scholars. Indian Buddhist teachers also traveled to faraway places, carrying texts to disseminate the teachings of the Buddha. Buddhist texts were preserved in manuscripts for several centuries in monasteries in different parts of Asia. Modern translations have been prepared from Pali, Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan texts.
Okay, so I should end today's class here only because you might not be in a mind state to absorb more. Fine. So I'll be closing the class. I'll be ending the class. Thank you so much, children. And
Thank you,
luck
ma'am.
for tomorrow's exam. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, class.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.